So, we've been looking a lot at what it means to be in our classroom this year and what it means to be a reader. And in the last lesson, you introduced yourself. Before that, you talked about the kind of reader you are. And now we're going to push that and do some challenging reading together. We're going to be looking at social protest art. Art like stories or paintings or video games or movies that are created with a purpose to try to challenge and change and transform society. Particularly, we're going to be looking at a poem called The Hill We Climb. Now, you might have heard of this poem or its poet, Amanda Gorman. It was a pretty big deal because this poem was written for Joe Biden's presidential inauguration, and it was performed as part of the ceremony where he became president. So, our goal in lesson 4 is going to be to analyze this poem, try to figure out what it's doing, what its message is, and to understand how this poem is using symbolism and theme to push for an idea of change in America. So, in order to analyze the poem, one thing that can help a lot is knowing a little bit about its author. So Amanda Gorman is young. She is only 23, the youngest ever inaugural poet. And in fact, she is only one of 6 people to ever be an inaugural poet at a presidential inauguration. So just having her be part of this ceremony was already a big message. This was the president saying, I think we need a poet to represent our country. And I think that poet should be a young person, a woman, a black person, an activist. All of those parts of Gorman's identity contribute to the message that she's sending. And Gorman is very, very firm in identifying as an activist. She has multiple books out, and her work deals primarily with issues of oppression, gender, race, and African diaspora. One of her books in particular is shown on the bottom right there, The One for Whom Food is Not Enough. That title probably doesn't mean much to you right now, but keep it in the back of your head. We're going to hear that title again in our next unit because Gorman is actually referencing the play that we'll be reading, A Raisin in the Sun. So we know that Gorman is well educated. She's a Harvard grad. She comes from this history of activism, and she's bringing all of that into her poem. But poems can be a little confusing at first. They can be a bit daunting. They're usually pretty short, but they pack a lot of information and ideas into those short lines. So you want to read a poem more than once, trying to be a detective and uncovering the different meanings that it's talking about. So you're going to start by reading the poem and listening to it. We're going to get to hear Gorman herself reading her poem so you can hear where she thought we should pause, what words she thought we should emphasize, what emotions are coming through. Being able to hear the poem will give you a much better idea of the meaning behind it than just reading the words on the page, because poetry is meant to be heard, not just read. But then you're going to want to go back. After enjoying listening to it, you'll want to read it with questions in your mind, starting to dig into that meaning. What is Gorman saying? What ideas are coming through here? Are there any references you get? And then you're going to go through the poem one last time because in your packet there are some kind of challenging questions next to our poem that you are going to puzzle through using what you learn from your readings. You can feel free to work with other people as you do this. Everyone's going to bring their own perspective to this poem. So, having multiple points of views, trying to figure out these different parts of the poem together can be a really great way to learn from it. But before we look at the poem, we need to know a little bit about how poetry works. because it's a little bit different than the essays or novels that we've been looking at so far. Poetry has a type of paragraph like a normal book, but instead it's called a stanza, and it's basically a collection of lines that are meant to go together. In most poems, there's a line break between these stanzas so you can tell where each one is. In the copy of the poem in our packet, I've put little numbers in front of each stanza. So if there's a question that says in stanza 3, Gorman says blah, 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 just look for that little bracketed 3, and that'll tell you where to look. Poetry also has sentences, just like normal writing, but in usual writing, sentences go until some sort of punctuation mark, like a period. In poetry, instead, sentences are broken up into lines, and the poet gets to choose where those lines break. So if you look at the example stanza in the top right there, the first line ends with punctuation. When day comes, we ask ourselves, colon. But that second line just kind of ends. Where can we find light? In this never ending shade. So Gorman, the poet, gets to choose where to put those line breaks, usually to emphasize something. We tend to pay the most attention to what comes at the beginning and the end of a line. So by putting that line break there, Gorman is saying light is an important concept to think about. The lines in the poem will be numbered in the left margins. There's that tiny little one up there. Every 5 lines will be numbered, and the other lines you'll have to count. So, where can we find light? It's line number 2. In this never ending shade is line number 3. As part of the lines, poetry has a requirement of capitalizing the first letter of the first word of every line, even if it's not the start of a new sentence. So if you look at our stanza again, you can see the first letter of each line is always capitalized, which is a great way to instantly tell that you're looking at a poem. Poems don't have to rhyme, but many do, and we often think of rhyme as being a part of poetry. Gorman uses some rhyme in her poem. Even in that first stanza, you can see shade and wade. So listen for some of the rhyme that she's using and how she plays around with that. The most important thing is going to be to start to focus on the figurative over the literal. When we're talking about the literal, we mean just the straightforward, matter of fact, it is what it says. If I say, this is a water bottle, this water bottle is blue, this water bottle is empty, that's all literal. It's just fact. But if I say, this water bottle is empty, like my heart, well, my heart's not literally empty, but I'm trying to express an idea. I'm heartbroken. I'm sad. And that's how figurative language works. It goes beyond what's literally true to suggest an idea. And that's what poetry is really good at. We're going to be looking at 2 specific types of figurative language. First, we're going to look at theme, specifically the theme of change in America. And secondly, we're going to look at symbolism and look at the symbol of the beginning of a new day or a dawn. So, if you're not too familiar with theme or symbol, don't worry. Theme is basically the main idea of a story, and a story can have more than one theme. It's the message that an author is trying to send or propose. It's what they want us to learn from the story. So let's take the story of Beauty and the Beast, for example. One theme from that might be don't judge someone based on their appearance. Another theme from that could be it takes different kinds of people to form a strong community. So there are many different themes we can pull out of a story or a book or a video game, but we're looking for that main message that we can take away. And one great way to convey the theme is through symbols. A symbol is an object, usually something literal, tangible, touchable. that represents some bigger idea. So, for example, a rose often represents love. If you give a bouquet of roses to someone, you're showing that you love them. But a rose can also represent pain if we focus on the thorns. The eagle has become a symbol for America, and the American flag itself represents the country, even though, if you think about it, it's just some colored lines on a sheet of cloth. It comes to represent something much more. A snake can represent sneakiness or untrustworthiness in some cultures. In other cultures, they can represent cleverness or adaptability. So, symbols can mean a lot of different things depending on our associations with them. If you're a huge fan of winter, a snowflake can represent peace and quiet and beauty. If you hate the cold, a snowflake is going to represent dreariness and being stuck inside. So, as you go through the poem, you're going to keep symbolism in mind and look for the symbols that Gorman uses to create her theme of change in America. I also want you to keep Gorman's purpose in mind. In an interview, she talked about why she wrote this poem, and she said, "In my poem, I'm not going to in any way gloss over what we've seen over the past few weeks, and dare I say, the past few years. But what I really aspire to do in the poem is to be able to use my words to envision a way in which our country can still come together and can still heal. It's doing that in a way that is not erasing or neglecting the harsh truths I think America needs to reconcile with. Now more than ever, the United States needs an inaugural poem. Poetry is typically the touchstone that we go back to when we have to remind ourselves of the history that we stand on and the future that we stand for." So Gorman is writing this poem not out of nowhere. She's writing it in the context of the country she's lived in, her life as a young black woman. She's writing in the context of the George Floyd protests, in the context of the January 6th uprising at the US Capitol. She's taking all of these different conflicts and bringing them into her poem to share her message of what she believes America can and should be. So now you get to engage with the poem and see what you take away from it. You'll start by listening to Gorman reading her own poem as you read along with the lines. You can find that recording in Schoology. Then you'll read the poem again silently on your own, answering any questions you have, starting to dig beneath the surface. And finally, you'll go through it one more time and start to answer those questions in the packet, really figuring out what Gorman is saying and how she's saying it. So I really hope you enjoy it. It's a wonderful poem, and getting to hear Gorman read it herself is a great treat.